That Thabo Bester case is proving to be one of South Africa's most dramatic examples of an escape from custody. It's left correctional services officials deeply embarrassed after the convicted murderer, rapist and fraudster managed to con his way out of the Mangaung Correctional Centre. Now, many people are asking themselves, how did he pull this off? For more on this, I'm joined by the investigative forensic psychologist, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne. He actually interviewed Thabo Bester back in 2011. Mr. Labuschagne, thank you very much for your time once again here on eNCA. Just firstly describe to us, when you spoke to this man back in 2011, how did he seem? He told the court that he was raped multiple times, particularly by his grandmother's friend, I think it was, and then, a neighbor as well, a male neighbor. But this surely didn't give him an excuse to, perform the acts that he was found guilty of.
Yeah, well, first you have to understand that he's a consummate con man. He had fraud convictions before those rapes. Those rapes involved fraud, convincing people to come with him. In prison, there's these allegations that he was running these multi-million rand businesses. So fraud is part of who he is, and conning people is part of who he is. So you cannot accept anything at face value that Thabo Bester tells you. And as I always say, if he tells you that your heart's beating, you should probably make an appointment with a cardiologist to confirm it. And is his name even Thabo Bester? So everything that he says and does has to be treated with great circumspect until you've got confirmation otherwise. So that's, I think, one of the impressions. So we can't accept that those stories are true. But I did say in my interview to him that even if those were true, many people in life are exposed to very similar things or worse things, and they don't go out and hurt people. They don't go out and rape people. They don't go out and lie and cheat and steal. So that's never going to be an excuse in the court for his actions. He will be accountable for what he's done. And at best, a court might take that as a mitigating circumstance. But at best, that might take place.
But what type of person did you encounter during the time that you were interviewing him? Was this a person who was willing to be rehabilitated, showed any remorse?
To a degree. Obviously, at that point, he was talking about pleading guilty, and he did ultimately plead guilty to the 2 rapes. And then about a year, in the next year, he pled guilty to the murder that took place in Milnerton of a 3rd lady. So one can argue, is that a sign of feeling remorse? Well, yes and no. It kind of depends how much evidence there is against you. And, the last thing any rape suspect wants is the victim to step into a courtroom and tell a story about what happened. That evokes emotions amongst the presiding officer, amongst the people there, and he has no control over that. So you can have control, though, if you plead guilty, and typically a guilty plea, which is prepared with a lawyer, is going to be a very soft version of events. It's not going to go into gory details. It'll just be admitting to the bare minimum. So that could also be a measure of control and conning to some degree. And not necessarily a sign of remorse. He did say, he should go to jail forever. But again, he's a con man. So we have to be careful about impression management. He's trying to create an impression to whoever he interacts with that he wants that person to have of him. So again, you have to be very careful when you work with these individuals. In prison, you would have to be very careful because I can guarantee you their conning skills would continue in the prison context. And as we see, he was very successful. In fact, he was more successful in prison from a fraud point of view than he ever was prior to him going to prison for the rapes and murders.
So you describe a man whose character has a fine line and a very thin line between being smart and calculating, right? So were you surprised when you heard about the fact that for almost a year, his escape went undetected?
Yeah, as I understand it, people already suspected something last year, and the question is why that didn't become public knowledge sooner. Yes, and remember, the police would investigate an escape. You have an escaped person who's on the run. That's a police investigation. Correctional services might do their own internal investigation to figure out what happened, but the police have the responsibility of trying to find out where is Thabo Bester, because it's a crime to escape from lawful custody. And of course, if there's a dead body, we have to figure out where that body comes from. So the police are actually responsible for trying to track him down and trace him. So I understand in the early phases when someone has disappeared, you wouldn't want him to know that you've cottoned on to his story, because, of course, that would cause the person to flee. You want that person to think he's safe and follow up the various investigative leads. So it's understandable that in that early phases, maybe the first week or 2, that you're trying to follow up leads before he realizes you're onto him so you can catch him. But once you haven't been able to do that, you have a duty to notify the public. You have a serial rapist and murderer who's on the run, who's a con man. You have to notify the public. You cannot wait 6, 7, 8 months, because what has he done in the meantime? potentially raped people, murdered people, conned people, etc. And he has conned people. I mean, there's quite clear evidence of these actions that he was engaging in from prison. So that, I think, really needs to be looked at. And that, as I said, is the police's responsibility for tracking and tracing and investigating the escape from unlawful custody. The internal investigation by correctional services is really more for their own, they don't have the responsibility of investigating crimes. So there's two actual separate issues here that need to be really get clear answers from.
And you're quite correct. I mean, as a psychology, you can imagine psychologically what this has done to the public, especially females who are wondering, where this man is. So did you get a chance at all, Dr. Labuschagne, to speak to him when he was already sentenced, convicted and in prison? Did you ever have the opportunity to speak to him then?
No, so I spoke to him on the 11th of October 2011, which, if I recall correctly, was a few days before he pled guilty to the two rape charges. So he's in custody. I did not then go speak to him later. I think probably because of the fact that he pled guilty to those cases and the one in Cape Town, the murder of the young lady, that they felt it was not necessary, for example, for me to come and give additional expert evidence in court. And he got a life sentence, which was a foregone conclusion for the murder, because it was a premeditated murder. And of course, he got 15 years for the two rapes. So the prosecutors probably felt, in light of what he's going to face as a sentence, there's no need for me to interview him further, for example, for any purposes.
Without making any excuses, I mean, a lot of South Africans are trying to piece together how a convicted murderer and serial rapist ends up with someone who had the reputation of being a very good doctor in public, etc. Without making an excuse for the doctor in case she did help him escape, is there something psychological there about people in her position in society, ending up with men like Thabo Bester?
Yeah, and it's not the first time we've seen this. I mean, in my time in the police, when we were dealing with investigations, it's anything from, a guy who's awaiting trial for brutally murdering his girlfriend, and he gets a new girlfriend who knows exactly what he did and still stays with them and has children. I mean, so I guess it's a certain type of psychology of people who get involved with people who are awaiting trial or in prison, convicted offenders. On her side, again, he's a con man, so he's definitely going to be fostering relationships with people that have a benefit for him. As to her role and responsibility, it's really surprising. We'll have to see. I believe she's been suspended from the Health Professions Council, not because of this, allegedly because she didn't pay her fees. But I've had other offenders who have been disciplined from the council for pretending to be psychologists. And they also claimed it was because they are suspended because they didn't pay their fees. So I definitely would be curious to know why a practitioner was genuinely suspended from practicing, because most practitioners, you would pay your fees very quickly if you forgot, and you would be reinstated. Why would a practitioner not do that? So I'm curious to see what's going to come out from that. But again, I guess it's their individual psychology of vulnerability, but you have a mastermind manipulator. Then you can't rule out how much influence he had over her.
And you said con man, mastermind, manipulator. So basically, in essence, we're dealing with a psychopath.
Well, look, that's a diagnostic term. So again, one has to be very careful when we throw them around. And I wasn't officially there to diagnose him.
Okay.
All I can say is that if somebody in the future actually did such a diagnosis, I wouldn't be particularly surprised.
Well, thank you so much, Doc. Thank you for speaking to us here on eNCA. Always a pleasure speaking to Dr. Labuschagne. He is actually an investigative forensic psychologist, and he worked with people like Thabo Bester. He led the psychology team in the SAPS a few years ago.